The Beatles returned from Hamburg at the end of 1960 feeling like failures. John Lennon was grounded by his Aunt Mimi, and Paul McCartney had come home to the news that he had only passed one of his A-levels. It would be over a month before the band would meet up again, performing in the Casbah, the little club owned by Pete Best's mother, but there was still nothing coming from that. However, when they had managed to book a performance at the Litherland Town Hall, what awaited them was something they hadn't expected. The news of their performance in Hamburg had travelled back to Liverpool, and the experience had certainly changed their style of playing, making them sound harder and louder than before, and it also brought with it their first experience with screaming fangirls. Just to let you know, we're not at Beatlemania level at this stage. While Alan Williams was still technically their manager, Pete's mother Mona was doing more for them than he was at this stage, especially with where they were to perform. The Cavern Club down in Matthew Street had started out as an air raid shelter during the Second World War before being converted into a jazz club in the 1950s. The Quarrymen had tried to perform there but were kicked out after John Lennon had tried to play an Elvis song. However, Mona Best was able to convince the new manager of the club to give them a chance on the 11th of February 1961, and thank God he did, because this was where the popularity for the Beatles really began, slowly building until they were the most popular group there, which by the time they left the Cavern in 1963, they had played the club up to 292 times, playing during lunchtime and evening sessions with a pay of 25 shillings each. They had also hired the first of their little entourage, who I've always felt were just as important to the Beatles' makeup, that being Neil Aspinall, a friend of Paul and George's, who was hired as their road manager. They hadn't been at the Cavern long before it was time for them to return to Hamburg as part of their contract with Alan Williams. Fortunately, George Harrison had just turned 18, and Paul and Pete's incident last time had been paid off. Going back to Hamburg excited Stu Sutcliffe, as it meant being back with his fiancée Astrid, and it was a good opportunity to tell John that he wanted to leave the band. He had felt that he didn't fit in musically wise and wanted to focus more on his art skills in Hamburg. So with Stu gone, that left the bass guitar open for vacancy, and with no one else willing to take it, Paul opted to play bass. And he never looked back. It was also while in Hamburg the Beatles got the chance to play on a record as a backing group for Tony Sheridan's new single, My Bonnie. I've got a bit of a unique history with the song My Bonnie. When I was studying musical theatre in college, My Bonnie was one of our vocal exercises. A few months later, back in Liverpool, Brian Epstein had been getting curious about this group called the Beatles that were appearing in issues of Merseybeat, which he sold in his record store, and teenagers were asking if he had My Bonnie by the Beatles. Eventually, Epstein and his personal assistant, Alistair Taylor, decided to visit the Cavern on November 1961, in which Epstein fell immediately in love with them. Or rather, I should say he fell in love with John Lennon, but I'll get more into the logistics of that later. Epstein congratulated the boys after the concert and would continue to come down to the Cavern to watch them, and the boys would always notice him, especially since he always turned up dressed in his best suit, until finally Epstein plucked up the courage and asked the question, "Would you like me to be your manager?" At first, the Beatles were unsure because, in their eyes, Alan Williams was still their manager, even though Epstein had confirmed that he didn't really have any legal ties with them, and because Paul and George were under 21, they needed to have their parents' permission before giving into any type of contract. But nevertheless, things worked out, and the Beatles signed a 5-year contract with Brian Epstein on January 1962, in which Epstein would receive 10 to 15% of their revenue. However, there were still the deals Williams had made with Hamburg. Epstein fought hard to try and get the Beatles out of their contract with Bert Kaempfert, the producer of Tony Sheridan's My Bonnie, and he eventually agreed to release them if they performed once more in Hamburg. However, tragedy met the Beatles when they arrived in Germany this time. Astrid met them at the airport to tell them that Stu Sutcliffe was dead. He had been suffering from severe headaches for a while, which often left him temporarily blind until he had collapsed in one of his art classes and tragically died on his way to the hospital at the age of 22. The autopsy revealed the death to have been caused by a brain hemorrhage, which many have linked back to a moment when Stu had been ambushed in an alley by thugs and been struck across the head. However, John Lennon believed that Stu's death was his fault. He mentions a story where he and Stu had a heated argument and John violently threw a lamp at Stu's head, knocking him unconscious. For the rest of his life, John lived with the guilt that he might have actually killed his best friend. But while this was happening, Brian Epstein was trying to find a record company that would take the Beatles. He had been trying since December 1961, but by March 1962 he had been turned down by every major record company in London. The most famous of these was Decca, in which they had said the infamous line, "Guitar groups are on the way out, Mr. Epstein. The Beatles have no future in show business." Epstein believed that it was the Beatles' image that was the issue, so he instructed the Beatles that from now on they were not to eat, drink, smoke, swear, and fight on stage, and he took them out of their jeans and leather jackets, which they had practically lived in for 2 years, and put them in the now iconic dark grey suits and the ankle Cuban-heeled boots. However, while the discussions with Decca were faltering, Ron White, who was working at EMI, had also been in talks with Brian Epstein about signing the Beatles on with EMI. But like I said, they were rejected by all the major producers. But then suddenly they found themselves signed on to Parlophone, a cut-off branch of EMI, with producer George Martin showing some interest. Now, on the outside, Martin would seem like an odd choice, since, despite having an interest in classical music, he wasn't really a music producer. He was a comedy producer, having produced records for Spike Milligan and Peter Sellers, who, along with Harry Seacombe, had made up the popular radio series The Goon Show, which, if you wanted to know where British comedy came from, look no further than The Goon Show. But that was more than enough for the Beatles to want to impress him, since they were all big fans of The Goon Show. The audition was scheduled for June 1962, and the Beatles performed a little number that Paul had written called Love Me Do. The song itself isn't brilliant. It is not exactly one of the all-time great Beatles songs, and George Martin didn't come back to Epstein with his decision until a month later, saying that he agreed to give the Beatles a 1-year contract with only one condition. He didn't want Pete Best. Now, the reasons for why Pete Best was kicked out of the band differ on whose side you believe. If you listen to John, Paul and George, it was because they felt he hadn't really developed as much as they had. His drumming was too hard, always favouring the bass drum, and not really keeping in time. And the decision to replace him with Ringo Starr was because during some of their sessions in Hamburg, and even sometimes on My Bonnie, Pete wouldn't even show up, so Ringo would have to be called in to step in and play, and they felt that during those small sessions they had made a stronger connection with the drummer from a rival group than they ever did with their drummer. Best, however, to this day claims that the reason he was kicked out was due to jealousy. He had always been seen as the most popular member of the group to girls, to the point where they were now starting to be billed as Pete Best and the Beatles, and at the insistence of Pete and his mother, his drum kit was moved to the front of the stage while John, Paul and George had to perform at the back. And the decision to replace him with, in his views, the shittest drummer in Liverpool was so that there would be no chance someone like Ringo stealing the spotlight from them. But whatever the reason, history happened. Epstein had to call Pete into his office and tell him the boys wanted him out. Though in actuality, Paul and George wanted him out, John was distracted by a more personal issue when his longtime girlfriend, Cynthia Powell, broke the news to him that she was pregnant. And John, despite always being seen as a rebellious youth, felt he needed to do the honourable thing, and the two were secretly married. To rub some more salt in the wound for Pete Best, Neil Aspinall, the Beatles' road manager and close friend to Pete Best, he had now started having a relationship with his mother, and she was also expecting his child. It just keeps getting more disappointing for Pete Best, doesn't it? Pete's sacking from the group sparked an outcry from the fans. They would boo and jeer whenever Ringo was on stage or in the street, and their performances would be drowned out by chants of "Pete best forever, Ringo never." Ringo's girlfriend, Maureen Cox, was threatened by Pete Best fans, and George Harrison had been punched in the face by an angered fan, receiving a black eye. But hey, they had done what George Martin had wanted, so now things were alright for them to start working. It turns out that George Martin was just as pissed off as the fans were. He explained to them he had never suggested kicking Pete out permanently, just using a session drummer for recordings. Pete could still have done live performances, and he'd already booked for Andy White to play drums on their recordings of Love Me Do and the B-side P.S. I Love You, so he wasn't going to step down and allow this new guy whom he had never met possibly jeopardize everything. Ringo, however, was allowed to play his own version of Love Me Do in the first session before being made to play the tambourine a week later for the Andy White recording, and it would be Ringo's version that would be released as the band's first single in October 1962. And it did okay. It only just managed to reach number 17 in the UK charts, and many believe that that was because Brian Epstein had bought up a load of copies himself just to make sure they got into the charts, and the Beatles weren't able to properly promote the song as they once again found themselves back in Hamburg. George Martin, meanwhile, was already working on their next single. He'd originally suggested a song he had found from Tin Pan Alley, the music publishing company in America, called How Do You Do It, and had originally wanted that to be their first single, convinced it would be a number one hit. But after they had recorded it, the Beatles told Martin that they refused to let that be the single, which is why they went for Love Me Do. It's ironic how when George Martin became producer for Jerry and the Pacemakers a year later and offered them How Do You Do It, it actually did get to number one. The Beatles insisted that they wanted to only perform their own material, and they wanted their next single to be Please Please Me, one of John's songs. The song originally was in the style of Roy Orbison. It was much more slower and more melodic, but George Martin didn't like it, and so the Beatles switched it up, making it faster and more upbeat, and including John's harmonica, which he'd also used on Love Me Do, and would continue to use up until his first solo album in 1971. After recording the new version, George Martin called out to them from the recording studio saying, "Boys, you've just made your first number one." However, before we continue, let's take a break and look into the life of the first Beatle, John Lennon.